Hi, I'm Drew, and I'm an amateur model builder. I'm building a layout in my basement called the White River Line, inspired by the Frisco Railroad in the Ozarks. Well, it's been a busy few weeks for me. My grandmother, who was 103, passed away a few weeks ago, so I went back home to attend her funeral and to be with family. I've also had a few scouting activities with my kids, so I haven't had much chance to work on my railroad in the last few weeks. Now, I know at the end of the last video I talked about finishing up some of the bench work, but I've decided instead to get started on building some of the turnouts for this layout. That's right, I'm going to be hand building the turnouts. I had a friend on the Frisco forum offer to lend me some of their tools for building turnouts, and I really just couldn't pass it up, and it seemed like a lot of fun. Now, I haven't ever built any turnouts. Well, since this is my first railroad, I haven't done really any track work, so this should really be a learning experience for me. Let's jump on into it. As I mentioned, the tools I'm using are from a company called Fast Tracks, and they make a wide variety of jigs and tools for hand laying track. These jigs for building turnouts are pretty popular because they really help to make sure the turnouts meet National Model Railroad Association standards. I started the build by making the guardrails that will be installed later on. Fast Track provides an extensive library of instructional videos for using their products. I'll provide a link to their channel down below and at the end of the video. The jig has guides for cutting these rails the proper length and getting the correct angles on the flares. Taking a look at the diagram of a switch, these guardrails help keep the wheels of the train on the rails as it passes through the frog. Setting the guardrails aside, I started on building the frog point. The frog point complete both the straight and the diverging round of the track as it passes through the turnout. Fast Track also makes fixtures to bevel the rail to the correct angle to build the frog point. I got a little confused by the use of the point form tool. I assume that you put the rail into the end marked frog on the tool. However, when I went to line up these pieces on the jig in order to solder them, the angles weren't right. So I put the rail back into the point form tool in the slot marked crossing and filed them again. This got me the correct angle for soldering the frog. I don't have much experience soldering. This is a pretty new skill for me, but I'm pretty happy with how this joint turned out. The next step was to add ties that the rails will be attached to in the jig. Printed circuit boards, or PC boards, are used. They're basically plastic coated with copper and are used in the electronics industry to, well, print circuit boards. In this case, These PC board ties are soldered to the rails and provide the primary support for them on the turnout. Fast Track sells PC boards routed to the correct width, but they need to be cut to the correct length. A little bit of filing is all that is needed once they are cut from the frets. Fast Track also sells a jig to cut the ties to the correct length. The final piece of prep for the PC board ties is to file slits in the copper so the rails are electrically isolated once these turnouts are wired up. Fast Track recommends a triangle file for this. I loaned mine to my daughter a while back, and it was lost to the abyss that is her bedroom. This flat file placed on edge will have to do for now. I put a set of files on my Christmas list this year, so we'll see if Santa brings it to me. Now it was time to prep the stock rails. These are the solid rails on the outside of the turnout. I clipped 2 rails to the correct length. I purchased a new set of rail cutters for this project and for the track work I'll be doing in the future. Up to this point, I was really struggling to get a reliably clean cut. Sometimes I got a clean edge, and sometimes they were mushed. I then realized that the outside edge of the cutter yields the clean cut, whereas the inside of the cutter leaves that mushed edge. I shaped the rail for the diverging stock rail, so it would fit along the curve in the jig. Once this was complete, I needed to remove a portion of the base of each stock rail where it intersects with the switch points. This is done so that the switch point will snug up against the stock rail, making a clean transition. I marked the stock rail along the length where these rails will intersect. Although finding a marker that isn't dried up in a house full of kids presents a challenge at times. To file away this notch in the rail, I used the Fast Track stockade. Removing this portion of the rail causes it to curve a little bit. I did slightly bend it back into shape, but the jig should help keep it straight until it is soldered to the PC board ties. I then placed the stock rail back in the jig and placed the rail shaping tools on top to hold them in place. It was now time to solder these rails in place. I started with the center tie. Then soldered the remaining ties. Some ties are only soldered on one side of the rail. Soldering them on both sides would interfere with the placement of adjacent rails or with the movement of the switch points. This section of rail on the diverging stock rail takes a little extra attention. It has a tendency to curve a bit too much. Before moving on, I made sure that all the solder joints were solid. The closure rails were up next. I snipped 2 bits of rail a little longer than was needed. On one end of the closure rails are the switch points. Returning to the point forming tool, I filed the angles for these switch points. This takes a minute. On the other end of the closure rails are wings. Prior to making this wing for the diverging closure rail, it has to be shaped to the correct curve. A small notch is cut and or filed out of the base of the rail to bend this angle. The top of the rail on the end of the wing is filed in order to ease the wheels of the train into the frog, guiding the wheels onto these closure rails. The closure rails are soldered in place at the frog and on the center tie. The point for the straight closure rail is soldered to the throw bar, taking care not to solder it to the stock rail as well. The other point will be soldered later on. The guard rails that I made earlier are then soldered into place. The final bit of rail to be soldered is the frog point. The placement of the frog is crucial. If the gap in the frog is too small, cars won't make it through the switch. If the gap is too big, the wheels might slip off the rails. I used an NMRA gauge and a wheel set to make sure there is a smooth transition through the frog. With the frog all finished, I removed the turnout from the jig. I again double-checked all of the solder joints. I placed a scrap bit of PC board into the switch at the switch point to create a gap between the point and the stock rail for the straight route. Then I soldered the point for the diverging route onto the throw bar. I then took a bit of time to fine-tune the points to make sure the transition from the stock rail to the closure rail was as smooth as possible. I soldered the bottom of the frog point to reinforce it and then used a wire brush to clean up the solder joints and clean off the acid base flux to prevent corrosion in the future. Just like with the PC boards, the frog must be electrically isolated to eliminate shorts when wired. To do this, gaps must be cut in both the frog rail and the closure rail. I used a jeweler's saw to make these cuts. There's always a little bit of awkwardness when using a new tool, or using a new skill or technique. This jeweler's saw took some getting used to, but I got the hang of it, kind of. I took a minute to use my multimeter and make sure there was no continuity between the rails. Now it was time to add the remaining ties using the fast-track laser cut ties. I used Pliobond contact adhesive, applying it to both the rails and the ties. Waiting for it to dry, and placing the rails on top of the ties as precisely as possible. Although the adhesive will cure pretty well overnight, it can be cured more quickly by applying a little heat. Using the soldering iron, I vulcanize the adhesive on the first and last ties on the turnout, and then about every 4 or 5 rails in between. I then carefully remove the outside bits of the laser cut ties, and my first turnout is complete. Overall, I'm pretty satisfied with the work I've done on this first turnout. The throw bar is a little crooked, and, well, the switch points don't snug up against the stock rails as well as I'd like. As inexperienced as I am, I'm not able to predict how much this is going to cause me operational problems in the future, but maybe I can place this switch somewhere it won't be used much. My soldering work is a little sloppy, but I'm sure that will improve. I have several more of these to make, so I'm going to get lots of practice. Thanks for joining me for this episode. Hopefully I can get a little more work done on the bench work in the next couple of weeks for my next episode. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook, and those links are below, along with information about the tools and supplies I use. Please leave me a like below. It's the best way you can support my channel. And please join me again next time as I continue modeling the White River Line.